Happy New Year's Eve. Subscribe and click the notification bell if you want more scary stories in 2019. Also, leave a like on this video to help us reach 2,000 likes. Thank you. So what makes demons different from ghosts and your usual hauntings? Well, demons are always out to torment you or harm you. Whether they scare you sleepless or attempt to push you right down the stairs, it's a safe bet that all they want is to see you in pain or worse. The following are 10 allegedly true stories about demonic encounters and hauntings. If you want your story featured in an episode of Darkness Prevails, share it with us at darknessprevails.org. We're looking for stories about national park monsters and scary stories from China. And don't forget, you can check out and follow my podcast at dppodcast.com. I Live with a Demon, from JD. Location unknown. It all started 3 weeks after my family moved into the house that we currently live in. Every time we would leave one of our rooms, it would be ransacked by the time we came back. Whatever it was would hit my mom's room harder than anyone else's. Her mattress would be off the bed, and her makeup would be scattered and broken everywhere. As for my room, it would always scatter my video game cases everywhere, and my covers would be messed up, as if someone had gotten back into my bed and rolled around. At first, we thought it was someone breaking into our house, but things began to happen while we were home as well. Specifically, and creepily, we would hear someone whispering in our ears. My mom was even awakened one night by someone loudly whispering, "Stop," close to her ear. After a while, my brother began to get increasingly frustrated and irritated all the time. Before this house, my brother had never been a cruel person, but something had changed in him. He would punch walls, scream at everyone. Eventually, my mother got tired of it and had to kick him out. After that, things seemed to go back to normal. It wasn't long until I was experiencing things happening. I couldn't sleep at night because I felt as though someone was watching me. After a time of this, I brought it up to my mother, who immediately simply told me it was my imagination, as if completely ignoring all the bizarre things that had been happening in the house. That night, I sat in my bed watching TV, trying to get this feeling to stop. I don't know when, but I finally did fall asleep, but a loud bang woke me up. I sat there in silence, not daring to move or make a sound. Eventually, I looked around the room, scared. I didn't know what was happening. My door that I had kept open had slammed itself shut. I shoved the upper half of my body under the covers, shivering with fright. I wanted it all to stop. I started screaming for it to leave me alone, because I didn't know what else to do. But I truly didn't expect something to reply. It growled at me, and then something began to laugh. Then my door burst open. My mom and grandfather walked into the room. My mom pulled the blankets off of me and wrapped her arms around me. I was so scared, more than I could express with words. I was 19 at the time, but I felt like a 10-year-old that had just been scared by a monster under his bed. A few days later, we had the house blessed. And 4 months after, which is the present day now, it all seemed to be over. But last night, I heard the laughing again. We're a few weeks away from moving, and I can't wait much longer. I don't ever want to experience this again. The Demon Before Christmas, from Micheal. Location unknown. This is a story from my sister that she shared with me. It happened very early one morning, at 4:06 I believe. Our mom had back problems and was putting off wrapping presents until that morning at the very last minute. My sister was there helping her, and she would take the wrapped presents and put them under the tree when my mother was done wrapping them. After this was all finished, when our mother went back to our room to go to bed, my sister decided to stay up on her phone. She says a few minutes after this, our cat, Coffee, went insane. Now, she didn't pay much attention since Coffee is still a kitten, very hyper and spastic. She didn't pay attention to it until she heard the owl hooting. Now, in our area, we rarely have owls at all, and usually not at all at winter. She immediately thought of this as strange and saw that it was causing Coffee to go even more bonkers. My sister said the sound of the owl hooting seemed to play on repeat. It wasn't like an owl was hooting over and over, rather like someone recorded it and was playing the exact same recording over and over. At this point, her curiosity was getting the better of her, and she needed to know if it was really an owl that was doing this. So she decided to pull the blinds up at the nearby window, and she says that that was the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Because when she looked outside, she said she saw something sitting on the lowest branch of the tree. A creature, she said, that had pits for eyes. Its body was humanoid, but its limbs were long, and it looked like it had never eaten before. But it had horns on top of its head, horns like a ram's, thick and large and bending around. But its body was hairless and pale white, like a powdery pale white. In her own words, she described it as horrific. The thing, with its absence of eyes, stared at her somehow. She was too petrified to even scream. It took all the strength she had and several seconds just to finally be able to move and run back to her room. Once there, she jumped into bed, pulling the covers over herself. But the hooting still followed, except now it was coming from just outside her window. This time, she would not open the blinds. She said she was so terrified, she jumped inside of her closet and hid herself there until sunrise. But apparently the sound stopped once she went inside the closet. To this day, she doesn't know what the thing was, what it wanted, what it was doing there. But these days, she gets a bit wary of Christmas and, of course, of window blinds. Ice Cold Hand, from Lucy M. Location: Hertfordshire, England. Back in 2013, I was living with my husband and grandparents. The house wasn't old, and for the most part it was just my family that had lived there, save for one previous tenant. One night, I woke up to hear a girl crying. A wave of fear fit me as my eyes caught sight of a man at the foot of my bed. This wasn't sleep paralysis, because I had already sat up. The girl's crying grew louder as I felt the menace from this silhouette grow. Immediately, I knew that this figure wanted to wish harm upon me and to the crying child. I remember being tired and scared, and I called out to the little girl that I couldn't even see. I said, "Little one, take my hand." Stupid but equally gratifying, her hand slipped into mine, tiny and ice cold. When our hands touched, the man disappeared, and I spoke to the girl to urge her to go on. After this happened a few more times over the week, it all finally stopped, and I assumed that the spirit of the girl had found peace. But the figure of the man continued to haunt me. For months, my sleep would be broken, and I would see him at the foot of my bed, his anger and menace causing bulbs to blow, items going missing, and constant nightmares. At a certain point, I thought that I was going insane. After one particularly bad episode, I had been followed all day, and I refused to go to sleep in my room, and instead opted to sleep on the settee, a small love seat with a straight back. But he followed me there. He wouldn't give me a second of peace, and his fury was so suffocating. It was like this entity wanted to end me. This had to come to an end. In the following week, I sought help from a witch and a medium. I was told to say the prayer of St. Micheal every night, and I was to go through the house burning sage and reciting protection and cleansing spells. And for a while, the man disappeared. I felt safe. That was until my husband and I moved into our own flat. You see, he hasn't truly gone. I've seen him out of the corner of my eye. It's more of a battle of wills now, one that is draining me. This evil entity is waiting for me to make a mistake and to forget to recite a spell and prayer. One opening may be all he needs. Let's hope I don't give him one. Demon or Prank, from Dylon. Location unknown. I was young when this happened, 2nd grade, I think. One of my mother's friends had come over, and she brought her son, and he in turn brought one of his friends. They were both older than me. The woman's son was named David, and his friend was John, both of whom were teenagers. Now I should say that I used to live in a giant igloo, by which I mean my house was white and shaped like an igloo, and it was set in the woods a bit. There is a parking space for roughly 5 cars to the right of the house near the garage, which is connected to the basement. The house was set into a steep hill, probably 45 degrees or steeper, and as I said before, the house was surrounded by forest. It was dark by then, probably 9 p.m. or later. David, John, and I were bored, so we had the idea to play hide and seek. I put on a camouflage coat and a plastic army helmet, being obsessed with the army back then, plus I thought it'd give me an advantage when hiding. Unfortunately, though, I was it first. I was able to find John pretty quickly, and with how I play hide and seek, when you find people, they have to help you look for the other person. So me and John were trying to find David now. We checked by the cars, out by my playset, by my dad's work shed, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when things got weird. John heard someone in the woods, so we headed in. At the time, I thought myself brave, like a little soldier boy, so I had no problem walking right into those dark woods to find David. We found where the sound had come from, and when we looked up into a tree, we saw a figure sitting there. Obviously, we assumed it was David, so we yelled out, "We found you, Dave! Come out!" The figure moved to look at us, but it didn't seem to react beyond that. Again, we yelled up to him, "Dave, come on, man, we found you. Get down so we can start playing again." The figure stood there in the tree, and just as we were about to shout out again, it spoke, a voice that was deep and gravelly.
"Who is Dave? My name is not Dave."
We didn't buy it. We confronted him. "Knock it off, David. We're ready to keep playing and you're not gonna scare us." Again it said, almost screeching now,
"I am not David."
as the thing that we now obviously knew wasn't David began to growl like a wild animal. John and I looked at each other and ran off screaming. We didn't stop until we found ourselves back under the backyard deck. We waited about 10 minutes. Then we steeled ourselves and grabbed some weapons. I had a hockey stick and John had a baseball bat. We didn't want to be babies, so we went back to that tree. We wanted to know what happened to David, but the figure was gone. We headed back around the house the opposite way and made our way to the cars where David was walking towards us. He was confused and concerned by the look on his face. He wanted to know what was taking us so long and what the noise he had heard was. Still creeped out, yet suspicious. We weren't exactly buying that it wasn't him that was messing with us, but he swore over and over again that he didn't know what we were talking about. He said he had heard us scream, and he had heard something growl, and so he was as confused as we were. It's been decades since, and I accept it must have been him, because even to this day, after so many years, he says that it was no prank. But there's still a part of my mind that questions, who did we encounter that night? My dad sold his soul to the devil. From Cody-Donovan 93. Location, Michigan. This happened when I was about 5 or 6 years old. It was when we had first moved to Michigan from Florida. I'm 25 now, so it's quite an old story. Now, you need to understand that my dad was a big hunter. When I was growing up, he lived and breathed hunting. He loved getting new bows and everything that goes with it. Also, I was very young at the time, so I had to ask my mom about a lot of the details that I didn't know about or couldn't remember precisely. Now, my mom didn't find out until years later that my dad had made a deal with the devil. He said one night he was drunk. He was crying. He had a lot of problems at the time. He was stressed more than ever. And on top of it all, my dad was having a terrible hunting season. Hunting being one of the few things he enjoyed anymore. So after complaining to no one in particular, he said out loud that if he could at least get a big deer, he would trade his soul for it. And the following day, he ended up getting the biggest deer of his life. About a week after that, my dad was taking a nap on the couch after work, and my mom was sitting in the living room. We had one of those huge wraparound couches, so they were both on it. She said he woke up and just started staring at the ceiling. She went over to ask if he was all right, but when she saw his eyes, she freaked out. They were a dark yellow color. She screamed at him and shook him until he snapped out of it, but he had no memory of it happening. Life went on normally for about a month after that, until one day we saw a black-looking burn on our wooden door that led upstairs. The burn was at head level. It just kind of looked like a burn at first, but that would change over the next few weeks. The vague shape slowly began to look more demonic, settling into a vaguely human form with a twisted, smiling face and even had sharp-looking teeth. Eventually, my mom got sick of looking at it and decided to put up a picture of Jesus over it, which covered it for a night. But the next day, the burn mark expanded as it began to grow a human-like body, save for 3 snake heads like cobras on its chest. After that, we stopped sleeping upstairs. Then me, my mom and dad and sister slept in the living room. Every time we would go by that door, we would hear our names being whispered, like it was daring us to go upstairs, taunting us. At this point, my mom and dad had begun fighting all the time. It got really bad, and one day my dad ended up cheating on my mom, which led to them splitting up. I also want to note that I had a bunny rabbit named Buster at the time. He was the sweetest rabbit ever. But when this all started, he went insane and would attack everyone who got close, including me. One day he got out and chewed up everything he could get his teeth on. After that, we had to put him down. It was depressing. The house was so bad that when you walked in, you could just feel a dark and depressing presence over you. And every time we saw the demon on that door, it seemed to have a different face. One day it'd be smiling, and the next it would have an angry look. Stuff would move around the house. We would hear stomping coming from upstairs. We got so sick of it that we called our uncle, who was a pastor at the time, and 2 other pastors came with him, blessing our house and trying to get rid of the demon inside, but I don't think it worked. We eventually just moved out of the house because we could not take it a moment longer. My mom and dad split up, and I stopped talking to him. I know he had a tough life dealing with addiction and alcohol abuse, also being shunned by my whole family for all kinds of things. I know some people will wonder why my mom or dad didn't just remove the door or replace it, but my mom said that she was worried that if they did that, it would only make things worse, or the figure would just show up on another door. To this day, I don't know what became of that house. I pray that another family is not dealing with it. This was a very traumatizing time in my life, but it was not the last of my stories. The Demon in My Room, from Otaku Rush. Location unknown. I'm 21 years old, and I've been fighting an uphill battle with depression for a long time now. In the past year, I've attempted to take my life twice, but for the better, I did not succeed. Now, a year ago, I began noticing that something was off when my cats began avoiding coming into my room entirely, even when I left the door open for them. Instead, they would simply stare into my room before running off. Then came the knocking at the walls. Figuring it was just a squirrel or something, I knocked back, not expecting anything worse, let alone a response. So I was shocked when I heard whatever was in the wall knocking back. Eventually, the knocking, which was located in one area, now seemed to be coming from everywhere. I couldn't take it anymore, so I grabbed my Bible and shouted a prayer. The knocking stopped, for a while anyway. 6 months ago, I was awakened at 3 a.m. to the sounds of loud thudding footsteps coming from the attic above my room. In my sleep-deprived state, I just told whatever was making the racket to screw off and let me sleep. The thudding footsteps only occurred in the attic above my room. When I told my mom about this, she said it's probably a squirrel or something. Things have only gotten worse, because now I've begun waking up with unexplained scratches and marks on my body that were not there the night before. I've been seeing black shadowy figures in my peripheral vision in my room, and I'm having awful nightmares. Ones that I cannot wake up from, and I have to let them finish. I've done everything I can think of to make this demon leave me alone, but I believe it is attached to me, drawn to the negative energy I give off. And when I'm going through a depressive episode, it only gets worse. The last incident occurred over a week ago. I woke up at 4 a.m. to find long scratches on my right leg, near the ankle. I'm very thankful, though, that I haven't seen this entity, but I wonder why the Lord's Prayer only sometimes works. Demonic Apartment, from Starsmore. Location unknown. Let me start off by saying that the paranormal has never been something unusual in my life. My earliest memories, in fact, are of my maternal grandfather putting me in his lap and singing to me. If me or my older brother had a nightmare, he would comfort us and tuck us in again. But the thing is, we were born in 79 and 82, and my maternal grandfather passed away 10 years before that. Because of this, I was never really worried about there being a spirit living in our basement bedroom, and I even grew up thinking it was normal. When I was 16, I met a woman who would later become my wife. She too had had paranormal experiences throughout her life, and she instantly recognized the spirit in the basement as a child ghost. We fondly named the spirit Charlie, since we didn't know the gender of the ghost. Charlie was a very mischievous spirit who liked to pull blankets, open up cabinets, spread candy all over the floor, and pull out comic books from my drawers. When I was 20, I got my first real job and moved into my own apartment. It was a one-bedroom with a hob. It was very tiny, especially for one person and 2 cats, but it was still very much homey, partly because I quickly noticed that Charlie had followed me there. At first, I didn't experience anything strange about it. I had heard that no one lived there for more than a year before, but I attributed that to the size. It's not the kind of place you want to live there for a long time after all. But after a while, I started noticing small things like stuff disappearing, which I would just attribute to Charlie. The cats were afraid of the closet as well, and my mental state began to deteriorate. Moving in, I was friendly, happy, and positive. But by then, I was starting to fear and hate everything around me. I developed a fear for water, telephones, open spaces, small places, using the hob, and talking to my neighbors, just to mention a few. The first time my future wife came over, she noticed it immediately. She said the apartment felt really cold, even though it was summer and the indoor temperature in all the other apartments in the complex led the other tenants to always have their windows opened. But my apartment was freezing. One night, when we were discussing ideas for a potential horror series we could make, suddenly all 4 of my windows slammed open. I had locked them tight, I know this, and there was no wind outside. It got so cold we could see our own breaths, and it felt like someone or something was trying to crush our chests. The cats freaked out, then ran to hid in the bathroom. I sat there paralyzed, but my wife just looked around the room and said, "Whoever you are, I'm sorry. We can't help you. Go somewhere else." A few moments passed and the room slowly warmed up. The cats came back into the room and we could breathe freely again. It was one of the most horrible, oppressive feelings I've ever felt. Every now and then, I was sure I could see a black orb creeping along the walls, day or night. And every time I saw it, I got a feeling of despair and unwillingness to live. I lasted 9 months in that apartment before I moved back with my parents and spent several stints in a psychiatric ward. The last time I spent there was 2 weeks before I was supposed to move out. I had attended a concert with an old friend and was in a really good mood. I called her to say I was in the apartment and hung up. When I looked up at the clock, almost 2 hours had passed since I had walked through the door. My right wrist was cut, and there was a knife with red on it lying in my left hand, 3 empty beer cans next to it. I freaked out and called an ambulance. I would later find out that several previous tenants to that apartment complex had taken their lives while living there. So I count myself lucky to have gotten out of there alive. My dad saw a demon. From Erin. Location unknown. This is a story my father told me once. He was often reluctant to talk about it and would remain stone-faced when he would tell this story. He had never been one to make up stories before, and didn't have much of a creative imagination, which helped folks believe his tale. Not to mention, my uncle also saw this demonic entity, but will say nothing more than both he and Dad saw it, leaving Dad himself to repeat the tale. My grandparents divorced when my dad was 8, and his mother was awarded full custody after his father signed away all parental rights to 4 kids. Dad was the oldest of the 4, with my uncle being the second, followed by my aunts. My grandmother barely had any money, so she had to rent a small 2-bedroom house in a bad area of town, as it was all she could afford. My dad and uncle shared one room, my aunts shared the second, and my grandmother slept on the couch each night. In the morning, Dad complained about a non-human-like entity that was in his bedroom. He said it kept him and my uncle awake at night. My uncle was too afraid to say anything, and only nodded when Dad spoke about it. My grandmother thought that the creature was a bad dream brought on by stress of losing their father, moving, and too many late-night horror films. Dad would go on to say the demonic entity felt cold, and it would take 2 different shapes. Sometimes it would float in the shape of a human heart with fangs in the center. Other times it was in a humanoid shape, where the heart and fangs where the head should be. The demonic entity never physically harmed them, but would rather like to toy with them by staying in doorways or areas where they frequented, so that they'd be forced to confront it or wait for a rescue. My uncle and Dad would share a bed sometimes to try to keep the entity from getting to them, as they felt they would be protected by safety in numbers. The 2 of them would not go to the bedroom at night, but would rather escape through the window and climb back in when they were done. It didn't take long for Dad to start developing bladder and kidney infections, because he would try to hold it in for as long as possible. My uncle developed multiple scrapes and bruises from going in and out the window all the time. My grandmother herself never saw the demonic entity, but once the infections and scrapes started, she began to believe there was something bad in the house. My aunts never mentioned seeing anything, and to this day we don't know if they did see something or if they never wanted to talk about it. My grandmother sold everything that she could and let the boys sleep on the couch while she slept on the floor. When she had just enough to rent another house, she broke the lease on the one they were living in and they left. Dad said he never knew what happened to the entity, but he did know for a long time the house had a very high turnover rate of renters who would pack up and leave suddenly. He was grateful the entity never tried to harm him, but he always prayed that he would never see it or anything like it again. The Demon on the Road. From Kristin. Location unknown. When I still lived with my parents, I used to go for walks at night. It was just easier because we lived across from a factory, and there was always a lot of traffic during the day. Plus, I had a cat named Miss Kitty that would always follow me like a dog. One summer night, probably 5 to 7 years ago, Miss Kitty and I went for our usual walk. We always walked to the end of the street where the field was because she liked to catch mice, and I enjoyed watching her play in the field. Miss Kitty was playing and I got a text from my friend. I answered it and was waiting for Miss Kitty, who was on her way back to me. I was standing on the road and she was in the field. I stopped as Miss Kitty suddenly hissed. I turned, expecting to see the neighbor's cat. Instead, I saw a very tall, hunched-over creature walking down the middle of the road toward the fields. I was in the shadows, and this thing was walking under a streetlight. It reminded me of a minotaur, but it had the face of a goat. It had large, shiny black hooves, black fur, and large, dark horns. I grabbed Miss Kitty and snuck away from it, not even daring to make a single sound. When I got home, I told my mom, but when we looked out the door, it was gone. I haven't seen it anymore, but I still think about it from time to time. I don't know exactly what it was, and I really wish I had snapped a picture of it, but I didn't think about it. I was just trying to make sure my cat and I walked away alive. The Family Compound, from Robert F. Location, Pennsylvania. My aunt and uncle live in what we call the compound, a trio of old colonial homes made up of a farmhouse, a converted barn, and a converted carriage house. The buildings are old. They were clearly built when Pennsylvania was just founded. Growing up, all the kids and cousins in my family agreed that the place always seemed weird. None of us liked being alone in the place, and even thinking about going into the basement was insane to anyone under the age of 12. Of course, the property had history. What we know for sure is that the property was owned by the heiress of the Campbell Soup Company. Yeah, the same chicken noodle soup company you know and love. Then it was taken by the Catholic Church, specifically the Jesuits, as the region experienced a boom in the building of Catholic schools. For those of you who don't know, the Jesuits are the hardcore side of the Catholic Church. They were some of the more brutal priests in the church's schools, then known for beating students for minor infractions and ensuring loyal adherence to the principles of the church's teachings. After that, we only know that the compound had been in my uncle's family since at least the 1970s. The compound has several stories related to it. A primary one is that of a spectral farmer called Mr. Green Jeans. He stays to the outside of the compound near the farmhouse, and he acts incredibly misogynistic, forcing women to feel terrified and drained. The only thing that seems to have stopped him was a small shrine to the Virgin Mary, put out where he was constantly sighted. Another sighting was of a small child by a second cousin once removed of mine. When she was a little girl, she had an imaginary friend. And if you're a constant consumer of paranormal tales, you already know that her friend was probably anything but imaginary. She said her little friend was named Vulcan, but her parents thought nothing of it. Until one night her father walked out into his living room to see his daughter sitting on the couch with another little girl in a dress who appeared to be out of the 19th century. Now, this man has seen his fair share of things in life, pain and suffering that don't make him easy to spook or prone to false stories. The girl had no legs, but somehow still managed to make her dress move, as if she were kicking legs that weren't actually there. Suddenly, chanting began, and robed figures appeared through the far wall of the room. The ghostly child became agitated and was grabbed by the robed figures, then began to plead to not be taken. The father grabbed the girl, pulling at her hands and failing to save her. Not because he couldn't grab her, but because he could not match the strength of the robed figures. As the ghostly child screamed, she vanished into the wall. My own mother had an experience in this house. When she was younger, she was staying at the house with a friend of hers from college, my uncle's sister. She was staying over and warned to not sleep with the lights out in the room she was in. This was in the farmhouse, which had several spare bedrooms at the time. It was a night of partying, which the compound is still known for, and eventually my mother had to call it a night. Settling under the covers, my mother said that she felt someone settle into the bed next to her, and she figured it was just her friend, also tired from the party, and too plastered to care that they had to share a bed. Until said friend threw the door open and screamed, "Don't turn out the lights!" As the lights came on, the weight next to my mother vanished. These are just the stories I can recall with clarity. It's been years since I heard them all, and the family doesn't like to talk about them for fear of giving the spirits in the compound attention. What I do also know is that my girl is sensitive, able to pick out negative energy from a place. The first time she went to the compound when we had first started dating, I decided I'd give her a cute little tour, while everyone else was preoccupied with another party. At first, she enjoyed the spooky stories of the place, but when we reached the room in the farmhouse we call the library, her mood immediately shifted, and she wanted to get out of the house. For the next week, she had nightmares about 9 children perishing. Freaky enough, but then there was the time that one of the children that grew up in the place played with the Ouija board. Dumb, yes, but the board claimed that there were 9 spirits that called the compound their own, 8 ghosts and a demon. To this day, the houses are filled with religious iconography, and priests come at least twice a year to bless the place. For the past few years, the place has been quiet, but as the years go on and the owners age, I wonder myself what happens if a less devoutly Catholic family decides to make changes to the compound. Changes the spirits, particularly the demon, won't like. Well, that's demons for ya. Always haunting up the place. Always trying to tickle your toes when they poke out from your blanket. Always trying to rip your throat out when you close your eyes. But don't be too scared, you may not have a demon at all. Maybe that horned figure appearing in your closet every night is nothing. Then again, I would sleep with the lights on for a while. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you want your story to appear in an episode of Darkness Prevails, you can share it with us at darknessprevails.org. We're looking for national park monsters. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/darknessprevails. Or you can click the shop button below if you're on YouTube, or go to teespring.com/stores/darknessprevails to get yourself some of my merchandise. Thank you. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous video about 5 New Year's horror stories. Zokus says, "Respond, Dad." Well, Zokus, if I do respond, I'd have to pay that child support I owe, and I just don't have the money. So, nah. Jesse Bajil says, "Face reveals and P.O. Box." I've got a couple of face reveals in my backlog of videos. And if I do live stream in the future, which I'm trying my best to get set up again to do, you'll see my face for sure. As for a P.O. box, I really need to look into getting one of those, but it may not happen anytime soon. If I do, you guys will be the first to know about it, and you can send me your haunted items. Ooh. Country Girl says, "New Year, same monsters." Well, I do hope we get some new interesting monsters. But that would mean that we'd have to have victims and experiencers to tell us about the monsters. So, we'll see. Paradoxic Donut says, early, I don't know what to say." Shh, your silence says it all, Paradoxic Donut. I love you. And Amillis17 says, "New year? More like new fear, am I right? I remember every time a new year would roll over when I was a kid. And there'd always be those doomsday theories, and I would be legitimately scared they were real. But these days, we just pray that the apocalypse is true." Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are coming soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, check out these credits for my patrons who continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.